Well, I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Joe Berry. Joe, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. So, Joe is the founder of Building Bridges for Peace. Joe is an international speaker, educationist, and peace activist. And today we're going to talk about your own story and how that's led you into just working in the field of restorative justice and traveling the world, essentially, spreading this message. So, if you don't mind, could you perhaps just tell us your story, please, as to how you started out in this journey?
Yes, very happy to take you back to 1984, a long time ago. I was just 27, and I remember waking up to the news that a bomb had gone off at the Grand Hotel in Brighton. And my father was a Conservative MP, and he was there attending the annual conference. And it took about 8 hours before we got the news that my dad had been killed in that bomb, and my stepmother very injured. And the IRA said they were responsible by the end of the day. Now, I did grow up in London with bombs going off and bomb scares, but I lived in peacetime. You know, it never occurred to me that my father would be at risk or any of my family were. You know, for that, I'm grateful that I lived in peacetime. But that event shook me to my core, because not only did I lose my dad, who I was really close to, but I lost the me that lived in peacetime, because now I'm part of a war. I felt part of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and I couldn't go back to the person I had been. So I made a decision just 2 days later. I decided to bring something positive out of this and understand those who killed my father, because I didn't want an enemy. Now, at that time, the IRA were the most demonized terrorists we had. Like, I was never going to hear about their motivation and who they were from the media. And this is way before the internet and Twitter and other sources of information. So I actually traveled to Belfast in 85 and 86 and met people, and it was an extraordinary time of going there. And like the difference of arriving in Belfast airport than London, like there were British tanks there, British soldiers searched my bag wherever I went. There were roadblocks, there were streets where completely been bombed. I went to safe houses to meet people. I began to understand the stories of those who lived in the communities which the IRA came from. And all the time I was there, I just wanted all the killing to stop. You know, it was kind of like, I don't want anyone to go through what I'd gone through, but of course they were. You know, and it was only in the peace process that finally there was some ceasefires and people got together and dialogued. Former enemies sat down and had the conversations. And one of the results of the Good Friday Agreement was that the political prisoners came out of prison. And there was one person who was in prison for his part in planting the bomb at the Grand Hotel, Patrick McGee. And I remember one day turning on the TV, and there he was coming out of prison. And I was not prepared for that. No one told me. No one sat us down and said he was coming out. It was absolute shock. And, you know, my first thought was, well, that's not okay. You know, what justice is this? He's got his life back. My dad can't come back. And I felt quite angry. But then I thought, this is for peace. This means less people are going to be killed, less parents being told their children are killed, less children being told their parents are killed, less loved ones. And so I welcomed it as part of the bigger picture. And then the idea came to me, maybe this is the time to meet him. And over the next year, I met people who knew him. I was traveling a lot to Ireland to attend workshops with people who've been affected by the terrorism, the conflict from all sides. And I heard that he was committed to the peace process. I heard he'd done a PhD in prison, and I was thinking, I need to meet him, not to blame him or tell him he's wrong, not to wag my finger at him and tell him he was like evil, but to see him as a human being, to hear his story, because that would bring something back that I'd lost in the bomb. It wasn't to change him, it was to give myself something back. And it took another So I met him in 2000, at the end of 2000. He came out in June 99. And that was a very incredible transformational time for me, where I finally got support for my own trauma. But I still remember the day when I heard that he'd agreed to meet me and was going to meet him that night. And I was terrified. You know, I didn't know how I was going to feel. I didn't know how I was going to be. All those years of not wanting to go for revenge or blame him, but it's quite different sitting in the same room. So I was scared, and I was also scared about him. How would he feel? Would he even turn up? And I mean, most people would imagine a meeting like that would happen in a safe place with facilitators, with support. We had nothing. This is just because no one would take, I tried, but no one would take us on. So we're in a private house in Dublin, just him and me in the back of someone's house, a friend's house, just sitting on a sofa. And I remember looking at him and thinking, well, you don't look like my dude, the terrorist, which is a very odd thought. Another thought was, Joe, go now. Go now. You're sitting with a man who's killed your father. This shouldn't happen. You're betraying your dad. Go now. So I was attending to different thoughts and feelings. But the bigger part of me wanted to listen to him. I wanted to see the human face. And he arrived. He's got a very soft voice. He spoke about his process of joining the IRA, why he joined the IRA, what that meant to him. But he used the word we a lot. We as a community were besieged. We had no choice. And I was quite familiar with the political justification, because I'd met other men in the IRA just a few months before, friends of his, in fact. And I could see from the way he was speaking that he was someone who cared for his community. It wasn't a response as pure revenge. It was something he thought deeply about, and he was a sensitive man. And when I realized that, or perceived his sensitivity, he's no longer this faceless enemy, this demonic labels he'd been given. He's a human being. But it's difficult to be with him because he is also justifying killing my father. And, that for me, the bomb did not work for me, obviously. And I shared a poem I wrote about him. And one of the lines in the poem is, I understand your struggle, and I'm sorry for the suffering imposed by my people. And he felt very seen in the poem and became a little bit emotional and said to me, how could you write this before you met me? It's about us. It's about me, he said. And the poem was Bridges Can Be Built. But I was thinking, I've got what I want from this meeting. I'm going to go now. And no one will ever know I've done this. I told no one. But I know I built a bridge, but it's a difficult bridge. It's challenging. And I don't need to tell anyone about it. And as I thought that to myself, and I was about to end the meeting, that's when he looked at me and he said, I don't know anymore who I am. Can I hear your anger and your pain? I've never met anyone so open and with so much dignity. What can I do for you? And I knew in that moment that he'd taken off the political hat, stopped justify. And what had been my need to meet him, it awoke in him a need to meet me. And he was on his journey. And he would later say that he was disarmed by my empathy. And if I'd gone in there ranting and raging and arguing, he would have stayed in a very safe place of self-righteousness. And the conversation changed. He no longer said we, he talked about I. And he wanted to know the kind of man that my dad had been. And he began to realize that he was guilty of demonizing the other. Like, he did not see my dad as a human being before that meeting. It was just legitimate targets for what he was trying to achieve. But now he realized was beginning to realize he killed a wonderful man with a soul. And after another hour and a half, I'd reached my limit of being able to listen to him and to myself. And so I called it an end and said, I'm going to go now. And that's when he said, I'm so sorry I killed your dad. Now, I didn't go for that apology because what would that mean? But what I got from that was a sense of my dad is now with us as a real human being. And that did mean something to me. And he's taking responsibility for the impact of what he did. And I remember leaving that meeting thinking, I'd broken a taboo from society. I'd met my enemy and I'd seen him as a human being. And that was difficult. But all I wanted was to go back for a second meeting.
That's incredible and incredibly powerful, and courageous. I wonder if I could take you back to the decision you made. You said just after a couple of days after the bombing that this was the route that you could go down. How did you find? What was your thought process around that, and how did you find the strength to do that?
You know, I look back to 27-year-old me, and I'm not quite sure. You know, because my daughters are now 2 or older, one's coming up to that age, and I, you know, I think about how they would be, and I remember thinking I was quite old, but actually it's not. And how did I? And I think it was because I was always someone who was anti-war. I grew up with also with Vietnam as well as Northern Ireland, and I just wanted to stop. I wrote poems about war, anti-war, and I spent a couple of years living in the Himalayas, meditating and trying to understand already what had happened to me. I'd already had some very difficult challenges as a young person, and I was someone who saw life as I suppose, as something spiritual, something where I could make a difference in the world. But that did not give me the how when the bomb went off, because it was a lot easier to meditate when I hadn't experienced losing my dad in a terrorist attack. You know, but in the real world, this is what happens, and I'd escaped that real world. And who was I going to be? You know, was I going to give up on the person who believed in life, who believed in love, who believed in that we're all connected around the world? You know, am I going to give up on that person and maybe become bitter and closed down? Or am I going to find another way to embrace what's happened? And that's what I chose, but I didn't have the how. I mean, my emotional intelligence back then was pretty low. You know, I almost used meditating to stop feeling, you know, and so it's been a hard journey without a map. You know, I haven't gone like a straight line. I've done some very difficult blind alleys and got lost and all sorts. But there was always something to come back to in me, which was that I have to bring some meaning to this, or I'm not going to survive. You know, I have to. So it's more than therapy. It was like a need to grow something out of this tragedy. And it had to happen very quickly because the pain was so great. The reality of living in that space where understanding war from an emotional perspective, from a trauma perspective, you know, and I think we weren't given any trauma therapy, you know, and there's no support, nothing. And I didn't know what to do with how much I was feeling. And so this was a way, I think, for me to survive and hopefully thrive, which I feel I am now. But it's taken a long, long time to reach this place. And if I can give something positive out of it, that brings sense to the absolute meaningless act of losing my dad in a very violent, very public way.
Yeah. So on that note, you have embarked upon a journey that's taken you around the world, where you have spoken about building bridges, about empathy, about breaking down barriers, restorative justice and trauma. So could you tell us just a bit more about the work that you've done and the main messages that you wish to convey?
For sure. And, you know, I do regard Patrick McGee as one of my teachers. You know, 21 years later, we've become friends. It's a difficult, challenging friendship sometimes, but I've been learning so much by engaging with him. And what I've learned from him, I've learned so much. One of the things is that he didn't, at 12 years old, decide to grow up and kill. So what happened to him? And what other interventions could have happened for him not to have embarked on that direction. This does not take away from the fact he did it, you know, and for me, violence never works. And I can understand why he chose violence. I don't think it ever works. I think it actually, it's taken away something in him. He says he's lost some of his humanity, and whether he will ever get that back, you know, that's his journey. So what could have happened, you know? And I think that gives us clues as to the kind of world we can create, that for, you know, a lot of young people, there are interventions that can happen to stop them using violence. And even now, when I work a lot in prisons, I work a lot with young people, and I think trauma, I think what happens to them sort of builds up to a point where they cross that line, whatever that line is. And everyone has a story. You know, I've never met anyone who, when I've heard their story, and even if they've done the most appalling things, and I'm talking about genocide, terrorism, all sorts of crimes, but when I've heard their story, I wondered, actually, if I'd lived their life, would I have made the same choices? And it's so easy to sit in judgment and go, you know, well, that's beyond anything I can understand. But that is when we're looking at it from our perspective, and maybe we haven't been through that kind of trauma. Like, I didn't grow up in Belfast. I didn't have grandparents who were the IRA. You know, I'm not carrying the legacy of being Northern Irish from a Catholic community. So it's pointless for me to say from my perspective I wouldn't have done that. Empathy, and I mean unbounded empathy, which we don't just choose who to have empathy with. But when I empathize with Patrick McGee, you know, I wonder if I'd lived his life, would I have made the same choices? You know, and that doesn't mean that I agree with what he did, but it's that empathy and that understanding. And I think we have the capacity to empathize with everyone. We can choose to judge people, we can blame them, we can make them wrong and decide to go for revenge. But actually, when we blame people, make people wrong and go for revenge, it takes something away from all of us. You know, I heard an extraordinary young man on a Zoom. Unfortunately, my traveling now is on Zoom, mainly in Myanmar. And these were young people who all experience conflict in their daily lives, and difficult conflict, you know. And even though I couldn't see them on videos, we created such a safe space, and they shared so much with me. It was incredible. And that is the privilege of my work. And one of them said he couldn't forgive himself for a fight he had when he was 12 years old. And he hadn't hurt the person like hugely, but he'd hurt them, and he was carrying that shame and that guilt, you know. And someone else was saying, but I really want to go for revenge because what's happened to me. And I said, well, remember that young man, the shame and guilt he's feeling, what he's lost in his own life for a much smaller incident. I truly believe we can't hurt each other without losing some of our humanity and maybe feeling such shame, but we have to hide that shame because shame is such a difficult thing to feel. I think shame is under there for all of us because we all hurt people at times in our life and we've all been shamed. So I think for me, the lesson is how can we communicate with each other without shaming and blaming? If I'd blamed Patrick that day, he wouldn't have changed. He wouldn't have opened up. I made it safe for him to open up and talk about what happened, and for him to make that brave, I think it was a brave step to see my dad as a human being. But unfortunately, the systems that we have, criminal justice system, court system, is about shame, is about shaming and blaming and making people wrong. And then what happens? People then build up more defenses. They're cut off more from their own humanity. You know, they might get more aggressive. You know, people react by either, I think, blaming themselves and getting very critical, and there's so much suicide around, or hurt other people. So how do we change that cycle of violence and revenge? By taking shame away, which is why I love the restorative model, because it gives people a space to see themselves without shame.